We are continuing our special coverage of the historic summit in Ukraine, between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin in Anchorage. Those talks, as we know, concluded a while ago with President Trump saying no deal has been reached, but that great progress was made with Vladimir Putin. We don't know what that progress was. During a joint appearance before reporters in which the Russian president spoke first, neither leader made reference to a ceasefire in Ukraine. Mr. Trump saying we didn't get there. The two leaders left without taking questions from journalists. President Trump later told Fox News host Sean Hannity the meeting was a 10 out of 10. Both Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump left Anchorage shortly after the meeting. Those images you're seeing now. President Putin with a little wave before leaving, and President Trump taking off as well shortly after that. Joining us now is our Chief North America correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue. Gary, we are, of course, waiting to hear more from that Fox News interview that President Trump did with Sean Hannity after the summit concluded. But we heard he said it was a 10 out of 10. We don't know more than that, do we?
We don't. And the interpretation of how you get to 10 out of 10 without a ceasefire, without a peace agreement, is going to be an interesting one to try and justify, I think. Yeah. I mean, it is fair to say, I think, this thing could have ended in disaster, in the sense it could have ended with one or other of them walking away and saying there's nothing to do here, there's no business to be done. That did not happen, which means while there's hope, there's still hope. And we are getting some words now from the Russian spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, suggesting that there's a sort of a pathway now to, possible settlements, I mean, very kind of vague language. But in the meantime, it will be crucial to see what happens, in the next nights in Ukraine. That's really what this is all about, and whether or not that bombing, those missiles, those attacks on civilians continue, because that's the thing that really exercises Donald Trump in all this.
That is true. And just to add to what you said, Dmitry Peskov, the exact words he said, this is the very conversation that allows us to confidently move forward together along the path of searching for settlement options. I wonder,
maybe it's lost in translation.
Yeah, exactly. Very vague in what he's saying there, but actually vague is perhaps the word we can use to describe that entire joint statement that we saw.
I think so, and I think, as we discussed earlier, it's really uncharacteristic, these big set-piece events, which Donald Trump loves. He loves this kind of limelight. He revels in it, and he believes he's really good at handling these situations, yet his comments were much, much briefer than Vladimir Putin's. No questions at all at the end. Again, really unusual in these circumstances, which suggests that either they're at a very sort of sensitive moment where they don't want to spoil it, or they didn't have much to say.
I'm wondering, Gary, as we've seen in the past few months, President Trump grow increasingly irritated with President Putin. That anecdote that he said, I go home and talk to the First Lady and I say, I had a nice conversation with Vladimir, and she said, that's nice. They've just bombed Ukraine again. You wonder if you start to see that language creep in again, if you do see the two leaders coming apart now, taking the next steps, and then the bombs continue.
Yeah, and we've been here before, haven't we? I mean, Donald Trump has talked about 4 times thinking he was on the verge of a deal, only for this sort of thing to happen. And he wondered, didn't he, at one point, whether he was being tapped along by Vladimir Putin, in his words. And he's used some stronger language in that to talk about Putin in the past. So there has been an evolution in Donald Trump's language. Yes, we've seen positive words today about his admiration, about them being able to do business, but there has been, I think, a change. And what I think will be crucial is how these calls go with European leaders, with Vladimir Zelensky as well in the next few hours, what they manage to extract from Donald Trump in terms of the detail of any substantive progress. Because if they don't see any, they're going to say so.
The bigger picture here, Gary, is that over the 8 months or so, more than 8 months that President Trump has been in office for a second term, this really has been the conflict that has vexed him. He said he wanted to solve it within a day into coming office. Here we are at this point, and we've seen this summit where they haven't been able to agree to a ceasefire. You wonder how engaged President Trump will remain to be going forward. Of course, we don't know what exactly we'll see in the coming days, but certainly it's been a frustration for him.
It's been a huge frustration to him. And of course, he likes to get things done. Promises made, promises kept, he said just when he won the election, didn't he? And he certainly wouldn't want to concede defeat on it. But there has been the odd hint in the last few days and previously that he is prepared to walk away.
Yeah.
That he is prepared to say, that's it, I'm going to focus on making America great, on what I'm doing, on my trade stuff. I've fixed a whole bunch of other conflicts, he says, around the world, etc., etc. And of course, there's the small matter of Gaza as well to actually look at. So, I think it's not impossible that he would get to that point. It doesn't seem he's got there yet. We just don't know how close he is to that.
Our Chief North America correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue. Gary, as always, thank you for joining us. Great to have you with us. And Rich, as we hand back to you, important to note that we are, of course, seeing at the same time that interview that President Trump did with Sean Hannity of Fox News playing out at the moment. So we're going to see what lines come out of that. Perhaps that gives us some clue as to what more was discussed behind closed doors.
Sumi and Gary, for now, both thank you so much. And indeed, we are starting to see lines come out of that Fox News interview, including Donald Trump confirming that he did have alone time with Vladimir Putin and that no deal is done yet. Well, let's bring in Ambassador Michael Carpenter, former Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council under the Biden administration and a Senior Fellow for Transatlantic Affairs at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Ambassador Carpenter, thank you so much for giving us your time. The two men in their press conference earlier did touch on European security, securing the future of Ukraine and the wider continent. What, for you, would European security look like in the next 12 months?
Well, I'm afraid there's not going to be much European security. The fact that the two leaders couldn't agree on a ceasefire, I think, is very telling. Frankly, I'm not very surprised by that because the fundamentals of the conflict simply don't augur for a ceasefire deal. Because President Putin wants to subjugate Ukraine. He believes that time is on his side. He believes that slowly he's winning. And so he wants to continue to prosecute the war. And President Zelensky, for his part, does not want to capitulate. He doesn't want to surrender his country to President Putin. But if you step back a little bit, I think what's interesting today is there two President Putins could have showed up at this meeting. One that was a little more political savvy, who could have made some superficial concessions and perhaps agreed to a ceasefire, even if he fully intended to violate it later, in order to demand sanctions relief from President Trump in return for peace. That Putin did not show up. Instead, the Putin who is imperialistic, who rants about history, who demands 5 regions of Ukraine be ceded to Russia, who demands demilitarization and all these various other things, that's the Putin showed up. He didn't give President Trump much to work with. And so he basically cashed in on his red carpet treatment and left.
There were those digs that President Putin made at Joe Biden. That will have been music to Donald Trump's ears. He's always happy to hear criticism of his predecessor. Now, you worked for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe under the Biden administration. President Putin said that these talks could never have happened under the Biden administration. Is that fair? Were those critiques of Joe Biden fair?
Nonsense. Look, this is the KGB operative in Putin coming to the fore, the master at manipulation, knowing exactly what President Trump wants to hear and saying it out loud in front of the world's press. So this was a bit of typical manipulation by President Putin. Let's unpack this a little bit, though. What would it mean for the war to have never started? What it means is that President Biden would have had to agree to the subjugation of Ukraine by Russia, because that is what President Putin was demanding. It's typical nonsense, but it's very much in keeping with character for President Putin.
On a practical level, if there can be some agreement when President Zelensky is brought into the conversation, feasibly, given the troops on the ground, how quickly could the war end?
I don't think there's going to be an agreement. I don't think President Putin has shown any signs of wanting to back off. In fact, if you look at the attacks, especially the missile and drone attacks on cities, they have picked up dramatically under the first 6 months of this administration, under President Trump, much more so than under President Biden. So President Putin is showing that he wants to continue the war, not wind it down. I think, if there were increased pressure on Russia in the form of sanctions, on oil revenues, because Western countries certainly do have the tools to go after Russia's economy, then I think you could see a scenario where if the Russian economy were in a tailspin and Western countries were really providing advanced security assistance to Ukraine, that Russia might tire of the war and we might reach some sort of an armistice along the lines of what happened in Korea in the 1950s. But that's, I think, the best that we could hope for. And that doesn't, unfortunately, appear to be in the offing anytime soon.
Donald Trump has told Fox News that the meeting was a 10 out of 10 because, quote, we get along great. But he did say, with all the things that they agreed, there are one or two pretty significant items to agree on. Ambassador Carpenter, what do you think those, quote, pretty significant items are?
Well, I think top of the list is a ceasefire. President Trump really wanted to be able to do a deal with President Putin to normalize U.S.-Russia bilateral relations, to enable for commercial deals, for U.S. exploitation of Russian hydrocarbons to resume. All of that was surely offered by President Putin. In fact, he alluded to some of it in the press conference. And so that's where I think President Trump wanted to take this. But of course, he couldn't do that so long as the war is raging in Ukraine. And it is really raging. I mean, I think viewers need to understand that Russia has instituted this filtration system with torture and rape and all kinds of war crimes being committed on a regular basis. So long as that is the case, President Trump is politically hemmed in, especially by the Republican Party in Congress. And you heard him say that when he said that if he traveled to Moscow, he would take some heat. That's what he means, is that he's politically hemmed in. And Putin just didn't give him the space to be able to cut a deal.